All right, so today we're going to be talking about properties and changes of matter. So remember, we talked about in the previous chapters what matter is, and then we talked about some examples of matter and its different phases, right? Solids, liquids, and gases. But now let's talk about some of those properties and then what happens when they change, right? So examples of physical properties of matter are just things that you can observe and that you can measure without changing the chemical identity of the sample. So let's think of like water, right? Water, the chemical identity of water is like H2O. So physical properties, again, are things that you'll observe that don't change that identity, right? So like the color. Color is an example of a physical property. It's something that you can just observe, right? You don't have to change anything about the substance. It's just a certain color. The length of something, same thing, right? You're not really looking at any chemical identity or anything like what it's made of. You're just looking at how long something is. Same thing with volume, right? How much space something takes up. And then opacity is just like basically how much something is see through, right? So if it is very opaque, then you really can't see through it. If it's less opaque, then you can see through it. Kind of like a window is opaque, right? It has a lot of opacity. And then chemical properties you see here are observed and measured as the sample changes chemical identity, right? So this is basically it is changing from one certain substance like H2O into something else like I'm just going to make something up like H2O2, right? It's no longer the same thing. It's no longer water. H2O2 is actually hydrogen peroxide, which you can put on your cuts or things like that. So again, chemical properties, some examples of that are like acidity. So like acid is the property of acid is if you pour some like hydrochloric acid on yourself, it's going to eat away at your skin because it is because of the acidity, right? Reactivity is just basically how quickly something reacts with something else. And we saw an example the other day of like a slide with if you put a little drop of sodium into the and actually, let me show you that right now. And so here's that example of reactivity that I was talking about. So the property of this is that it is very reactive, right? So you put a little drop of sodium Na inside of water, and it's going to react explosively, pretty much. So the reactivity for this is very high. Whereas you see, so let's go back here to the PowerPoint presentation. So yeah, in terms of reactivity, again, that is a chemical property, and then flammability. Let me go back real quick. So flammability is just again the ability of something, how likely it is to burn, and then toxicity, and just how poisonous something is, and these all have to do with like the chemical identity of a substance. All right, and so we'll talk a little bit more about some examples in a second, but just again, just a recap on what matter. What is matter, right? So the nature of matter, it's anything that takes up space and has mass. Right? Some examples of matter, again, pretty much everything that you can think of is matter, with a few exceptions. You can observe matter easily with your senses, right? So we talked about observation earlier in the term, and so things that you can observe with your senses are things like rocks, trees, bikes, air, basically everything and almost anything. The only thing that wouldn't be matter would be things like energy. So, like sunlight, heat, electricity, those are not matter because they have no mass or volume, right? So they can't be matter because they don't fit the definition. And so, physical properties, again, we saw a few examples earlier, but let's just see a few more. Physical property, it's a property that can be easily observed, right? But you're not really changing the identity of the substance. It's just an observation that you're making, right? Again, with your senses. So viscosity is just how thick of a liquid is. Conductivity, just whether basically if it can like soak up electricity and heat and kind of like pass it through, uh, kind of like metal, right? Malleability is just how you can bend or shape or mold something. And then hardness, whether something is magnetic, melting point, boiling point, density, color, all of these are examples of physical properties. So let's see a few more examples. So solubility of a substance is it's the ability for something to dissolve. So that would be a physical property of something. It's just like how it dissolves into something else. Conductivity, which you mentioned earlier, is just a material's ability to allow heat or electricity to flow, right? So that's why you never want to stick a metal object in a wall socket because that metal object will conduct electricity and the electricity will pass through the object and into you, which you definitely don't want. So examples of things that are conductive are things like metal, right? Metal has a high conductivity, which I just mentioned right now, but wood not so much, right? Wood, you really wouldn't be able to conduct much heat or electricity through those. You'd more likely burn down the piece of wood than it actually like absorbing and holding that energy.